Hello everyone, good morning. Good morning and welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, episode 146. It never gets less astonishing for me to read out the numbers. So my name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service. The Highland Archive Service has 4 centres across the Highlands of Scotland, in Inverness, in Portree, in Wick and in Fort William, where we look after the historic documents of the Highlands of Scotland. All sorts of things dating from the 1200s right through to the present day. And this series of talks was kind of designed as a way to introduce people to those collections if they were familiar with our archive centres, if they'd never been in, if they were never going to get in because they were across the other side of the world, whatever it might be. I hope that this series has opened your eyes to some of the things we hold in our collections. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer, and High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we very much appreciate that. Hi everyone, it's one of my favourite parts of my week, seeing everyone's hellos and good mornings and things coming in. It's lovely to see you all. So we're continuing this week by looking at the subject of changes as we have done so far this month. And this week we're focusing on something that is never far away from the headlines, certainly in the UK, but right across the world, and that's the subject of rights. Whether that is rights around sexuality, around disability, gender, race, identity, ethnicity, all sorts of things. So whether it's the rights of a certain demographic, or whether it's rights like the rights to a free trial, the right to protest, the right to free speech. We hear about rights all the time on news. It's a very complicated subject with a lot of differing views depending on who you are and what your own story is. So I'm well aware that I won't be able to go into all of that. But I wanted to share some stories from our collections that link to this subject. We've always had inequality. I'm sure that will be no surprise to anybody. And there have always been people who have had to summon up huge amounts of courage to stand up to fight for their rights, whether that's to fair treatment, to equal pay, for the right to vote, the right to access certain spaces, to wear what they want to. And some of those things, as I said, have been rights that have been deliberately curtailed, whether that's due to someone's skin colour or their gender, or some that have just been rights that have been never considered. So maybe rights that are some way impaired. So for instance, somebody in a wheelchair may have access to a place. They may have the right to go in, but actually if they can't get in, that impacts their right to get in there, if you know what I mean. So there's lots of different ways to think about that. And so we're going to look at some of the stories of rights in our collections and fighting for rights. I'm going to start in perhaps a slightly odd place that you might not expect. So one of the most common places that we find references to rights and to entitlements within historic archive collections is in charters, and in particularly in borough charters. Now, the borough charters outline the rights and the privileges of people who live within the boundaries of a royal borough or borough. These are the things that people who lived inside the borough could do that people outside it could not do. When I spoke recently at Dingwall Primary School, they were delighted to hear that there were some things that could be done in Dingwall that couldn't be done in Connan or in any of the other surrounding places. So here's a description from the National Records of Scotland website that outlines the borough structure and what those rights might have entailed. The earliest boroughs date from the reign of David I, 1124 to 1153. He introduced feudal tenure into Scotland and encouraged the growth of towns as a means of fostering trade and increasing crown revenues. The borough's privileges and obligations, including trading privileges and the right to hold markets, were enshrined in a charter granted by the king or other feudal superior. In return for these privileges, royal boroughs made annual payments to the crown of the rents of the borough properties and the customs of trade. Later, this became a fixed annual sum. Any surplus money was paid into the common good fund for the benefit of that borough. It goes on to say, at first, the boroughs were governed through borough courts, originally a gathering of all the good men of the community. Gradually, the borough court meeting in a judicial capacity came to consist of the bailies only, while the town council, provost, bailies and councillors attended the administrative business. So it goes on to explain the way that broke down and how that ended. So with the end of, as we come into the 19th century 1833 Borough Reform Act, the changes that brought, and the fact that even after that, royal boroughs still retained rights and privileges that others didn't. And that was really until the 20th century when that was stopped. We hold various borough charters within our collections outlining the rights of the people living in boroughs from everywhere from Fortrose to Wick. And so you can see from that very clearly, as we know, that rights give power, and automatically rights create division, because you're either in the club that has the right to do something or you're not. And if you're not, it's very hard to change that system, especially if you gaining rights means a loss of rights or a perceived loss of rights to those who currently have them. Very few people vote themselves out of a privilege, and as soon as everybody has something, it's no longer a privilege and there's no advantage to having it. So we see references to rights and privileges within charters. We also see them in other legal documents outlining the rights for things like wills. So for instance, a will record the entitlement of certain people to certain things. And then contested wills will record people fighting for their right, or what they see to be their right of what they're entitled to. Sesines, which are land transfer documents, charters within estate collections and other things also detail those kind of rights and hereditary rights. So there may be evidence of a piece of land that by right is handed on to the next generation. So you can see evidence of rights within these sorts of documents. Carrying on that legal theme, we can also see references to legal rights within our court documents, whether that's rights being asserted or rights being tested. So for instance, we have a 1585 decree about the rights attached to the King's Mills. So anyone familiar with Inverness will know the King's Mills area. At the time that it was the King's Mills, and the farmers thereof. So they were testing, putting into the legal system the rights that were associated with that area. We have a 1696 document that confirms the right of one John Taylor to extend the gable of his Church Street property, and a 1729 Borough Court document that details Duncan Grant's right to a tenement that he had possessed for 40 years. So we can see sometimes people going to the law to test and prove what their rights are. Some of those maybe you think are very standard, common things that people might be testing, whether they can extend a property or have rights to live somewhere. Some are a little bit more unusual. So for instance, there's a petition from 1728 in which Duncan Mackintosh appeals to the magistrates about his right to employ Margaret Sligo and the objection by her present employer. So that's a little bit more unusual. In Scotland, and you can tell me if you're watching elsewhere your thoughts on this from another country's perspective, but in Scotland we've always felt very passionately about our right to access places. And in 2003 a piece of key legislation was passed giving public access to most of the land and inland waterways in this country. But the fact that you have having the right to access that land is one thing, but then there are also rights on what you're entitled to do when you get onto that land. So how can you use it, and how can you take from it as well? So for instance, we have documents that outline the fishing rights on our rivers. Things like who is entitled to fish, where they're entitled to fish, and when, and what for. Because of course at that point also the animals' rights come into play, that effectively salmon have the right to be able to breed to a certain, their young to a certain age before they get fished. We even have, and this is one that interested me, we even have a document in our Howden's Garden Centre collection entitled A Guide to Plant Breeders' Rights from 1965. I mentioned right at the beginning that if you're not in the group which controls the rights, it can be quite hard to effect change. And we have evidence in our collections of people misusing their rights, or at the very least, using their rights to skew the priorities. In D321, which is the Ness Angling Club collection, there's this 1854 agreement between the club and a Mr. Tate, who was a perfumier in Inverness, that states that Mr. Tate will settle the club's accounts, thus giving him extra rights. So in effect, almost buying the right to do more than other people, literally by paying for it. Also in 1854, the Town Council of Nairn opted to adopt some of the measures from the new Police of Towns Scotland Act 1850. And this was an act that was designed to improve the living standards and social conditions of people living in the towns. And the towns could decide amongst themselves to accept any or all of the elements within this act. And in Tain they held a public meeting to discuss it. Except the only people who could attend the public meeting and who could, perhaps not attend, but the only people who could have a vote on what to accept from that act were male householders occupying premises of a yearly value of £10. So this meant that of around 2,050 people living in Tain Borough in 1854, 72 of them had the right to vote. So of 2,000 plus, 72 people had the right to vote on which parts of this law should be adopted. Therefore, many of the policies that they decided to bring in perhaps benefited that same section of society. They decided, amongst other things, that they would empower magistrates to summarily punish breaches of discipline, petty theft and minor offences. They authorised the apprehension and punishment of vagrants and those sending children out to beg. And they passed rules around obstructions and nuisances, so for instance people wantonly knocking on doors and generally being an irritation or annoyance to the inhabitants. So it's very interesting to me looking at that there's no thought there, or it's a very black and white end point document, so maybe there was discussion, but there's no evidence there of trying to support the vagrants or trying to work out why people were sending their children out to beg. Instead, they're authorising the apprehension and punishment of anyone out begging or wandering the streets. So it could be argued that that very limited group that had the right to affected change that was beneficial to themselves. Now, of course, laws change all the time, and laws change over time in response to circumstances, in response to pressure, to campaigning, to publicity. We've seen that so much over the last couple of years, that people protesting and standing up has the power to change legislation. Sometimes law changes in response to politics, sometimes it changes in response to religion. Nothing is set in stone, and that's both a very encouraging thing and also quite a frightening thing, I think. From a UK point of view, there have been many points, many times, many occasions where laws have enshrined the rights of people who in previous generations had very few rights and no way of imagining that their rights would be enshrined in law in years to come. I was joking as I was writing this with Fiona, that my line manager, that for the first time I think in 3 years I've got Magna Carta in to a Learn with Lorna. So Magna Carta, a 1215 Charter of Rights, stated that all, amongst other things, it stated that all free men had the right to justice and the right to a fair trial. Now again, like that Tain one that I mentioned, in practice this really excluded most of the population, because most of the population were not free men. But it was a start, and it stated for the first time, as well as giving rights to free men who wouldn't have imagined 20, 40, 100 years before that could have been possible. In addition to that, the single most important thing it did was that it stated that no one had the right to be above the law. Hugely important at that time because of the state of the monarchy. Now, this piece of legislation, although it is, 800 and something years ago, is still much revered, which is why I'm saying I'm surprised I've not mentioned it yet, but also it's echoed in the US Declaration of Independence, and it's echoed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So sometimes those turning points of law around rights and what people are entitled to have huge lasting ramifications. There have been numerous pieces of legislation ever since which have impacted people's lives and rights. So for instance, the right to freedom of religion or belief, the right to same-sex marriage or civil partnership, the Equal Pay Act, freedom of expression legislation, and numerous others. And of course there's still a huge amount to be done, and I'll come back to that. But I wanted to look at one of the things that people, particularly in the UK, often associate historically with fighting for rights, and that's the subject of voting. The fight for the right to vote and the fight for equal franchise tends to be associated with women in people's minds. But as we saw from that Taine document, for centuries male voting was also extremely limited and extremely unfair. And one of the big turning points came in 1832 with the Representation of the People Act, the Great Reform Act in England and Wales, and the Scottish and Irish Reform Acts that were all passed at the same time. And this was the law that had enabled many of those Taine men to be able to vote, those who had houses of the value of £10 and over. If that hadn't been passed, maybe, 10, 20 years before that meeting was held, very few of those men even would have had the right to vote. Now those laws, the Great Reform Act era laws, came from both political need for reform, the system was outdated, it was breaking down, there was a need for reform, but also from a popular desire for it. There had been riots and there had been protests. And in Scotland, the passing of that Reform Act meant an increase in the electorate of around 13%. So really substantial change, but of course still in no way fair. Now, of course, all the official documentation, all the archive material about that legislation being passed, the debates, the Act itself, are held in the parliamentary archives and in national collections. But we hold documents that shed a very personal light on the subject. So for instance, in our Monroe of Navarre collection, we hold this petition that I'm just going to share with you. And it reads like this. I, Murdoch Mackenzie, joiner, Janetown and Lochcarron, hereby claim as proprietor of the two houses, the one slated and purchased by me in the year 1822 for the sum of 100 guineas, and now rented for £9 2s yearly, the other made and occupied by myself, valued at £50, to each of which houses is attached a garden, and other houses, paying yearly rent or few, the one of 10 shillings, the other 6, also lands of the yearly rent of £5 2s sterling on a lease of 7 years. So he's detailing there that he owns two houses, that both of those houses have a high value, that both of those houses have land attached and additional houses on them. He goes on to say, having made my son Ninian Mackenzie, schoolmaster of Snizort, my heir to the said property, and in the meantime, so before he dies and inherits it, he's been made manager and executor to receive the rent payable for the properties, and is liable to pay all the dues on them, so he's responsible for these. I wish that, so he's wishing his own name and also his son's name be enrolled as voters for the same. And then at the bottom of the document, someone is signing to say, the supervisor of excise is signing to say that he occupied one of the houses above mentioned, the slated one, for the last 3 years and has paid an annual rent of £9 2s. So we really get an idea of the personal impact of that legislation change. This is someone laying out his case in detail, recording what his property is, what his entitlement is to be included in this vote. So although the big kind of overarching legal documents about this law are held in London, in an estate collection in the Highlands of Scotland, we can see the impact that this law had on one person trying to lay out his right to that vote. The idea of universal suffrage for men was still a long way off, and there were still years of inequality to come between rich and poor, between urban and rural, not to mention, of course, between men and women. And from a Highlands and Islands perspective, it was the 1880s that brought another turning point. Now, I've discussed in previous episodes the 1880s because they were difficult years. Poor harvests, terrible weather and storms, losses of crops, losses of stock, potato blight, poor herring catch, just a cacophony of bad things happening at the same time. And crofters across the area were suffering because their right to grazing had been removed, they were having high rents imposed on them, and they had very few rights that were secured. And they knew that their best hope at this time was to find and put forward an MP who would champion law reform, land law reform. But the crofters didn't have the vote. And again, it's that difficulty of affecting change from the outside when you're standing against the ones who have the power to make the change. Now, the Liberal government of the time wanted electoral reform, but the Conservative-controlled House of Lords had voted that proposal down. There was outrage across the Highlands and Islands because large swathes of the population had no electoral voice, and so they took instead to protesting. And on the 30th of August 1884, the Land Law Reform Association marched through Wick. Around 3,000 of them marched through Wick. There are some great headlines in the John O'Groat Journal about this, including "The Lords should emigrate to the North Pole as the people can do without them," which I thought was quite a long headline to put in a newspaper. Now, later that year, the Third Reform Act would be passed, and that was the one that brought rural areas in line with boroughs and finally enfranchised many of the crofters. In Caithness that year, the electorate took their new right to vote very, very seriously. They turned out in huge numbers through blizzards, through blocked roads, to cast their votes with the aim of getting a radical land reformer from the Crofters Party elected. Dr. Gavin Brown Clark stood against the local landowners' family as the MP, and he got in. The Crofters Holding Scotland Act became law in June 1886, giving security of tenure and establishing the Crofters Commission. However, certain rights were still not included in that big piece of legislation. For instance, the right to enlarge a holding or the right to create a new holding. And so it was deemed an incomplete and unsatisfactory act, and in Caithness, as in elsewhere, they vowed to keep agitating until real reform came for them. And I like this. Dr. Clark, that MP that they had got elected, told his constituents that the Act should be seen as an instalment of their rights. 10 shillings in the pound, and they would go on demanding until they got the other 10 shillings. So, still a huge amount to be done, but when you think that they had gone from having no vote to getting the vote to then using that vote to make change. A vote is a very powerful thing. By the time we get into the 20th century, we have higher but still not universal male suffrage, but still no women. And we can see in our documents the impact of women fighting for their right to vote. So, for instance, in the Chief Constable's police memorandum that I've mentioned several times before, where the Chief Constable warns the police to be on guard against misdemeanours by suffragettes and other irresponsible creatures. We also hold an interesting membership card. This is the membership card of Mary Beatrice McEwen, who was Mary Beatrice Henderson prior to her marriage, and it's her membership of the National Women's Social and Political Union. The NWSPU was a women's-only political movement created in 1903. The leading militant organisation campaigning for women's suffrage, it became known for civil disobedience and direct action. And this is what the membership card says. Object: to secure for women the parliamentary vote as it is or may be granted to men. So we want it either as it is for men now or as it will be in the future. To use the power thus obtained to establish equality of rights and opportunities between the sexes, and to promote the social and industrial well-being of the community. So that's the object. Methods: The object of the union shall be promoted by 1. Action entirely independent of all political parties. 2. Opposition to whatever government is in power until such time as our franchise is granted. 3. Participation in parliamentary elections in opposition to the government candidate and independently of all other candidates. 4. Vigorous agitation upon the lines justified by the position of the outlawry to which women are at present condemned. 5. The organising of women all over the country to enable them to give adequate expression to their desire for political freedom. 6. Education of public opinion by all the usual methods, such as public meetings, demonstrations, debates, distribution of literature, newspaper correspondence, and deputations to public representatives. And then the final section says membership. Women of all shades of political opinion who endorse the objectives and methods of this union and are prepared to sign the membership pledge are eligible for membership. So we don't care where you sit on the political spectrum. If you want women to have the vote, you've got a place at the table. It must be clearly understood that no member of the union shall support the candidate of any political party in parliamentary elections until women have obtained the parliamentary vote. There is an entrance fee of 1 shilling. No definite subscription is fixed, as it is known that all members will give to the full extent of their ability to further the campaign funds of the union. And it reminded me when I read it of when we look at the build to the war effort, particularly in World War I, but also in World War II, of that just everything else is put to one side until we've won the war. And it's very much like that. Everything is put to one side. You don't support anyone, you don't, nothing else until we've got this one objective. I also mentioned that the NWSPU in Sylvia Blaine's diaries. And of course, universal suffrage did come in 1928, the law giving the vote to all men and women over 21. But we remained, and we remain, a long way off gender equality and a long way off that objective there of equal rights and equal opportunities. The Sex Discrimination Act wouldn't be passed until 1975, and the Sutherland County Council Education Committee minutes of 1972 show why that was needed. So this is from the Sutherland County Council Education Committee. 1972. Married women head teachers. The Director of Education raised the question of the committee's policy with regard to the reinstatement of married women following the birth of a child. He pointed out that in terms of teachers' conditions of service, a married woman ceased to be employed following the birth of a child, but was entitled to have her name placed on a reserve list. A teacher placed on the reserve list was, when medically fit, entitled to reinstatement in the grade of assistant teacher to the earliest possible vacancy. So you can't have your job back. You have the possibility of being put on a reserve list where you might get an assistant teacher's job. The committee noted that they had not exercised the powers in terms of the teacher's conditions of service, in that where a married woman head teacher was suspended from teaching duty as a result of pregnancy, arrangements had been made to staff the school temporarily until such time as she was fit to return to duty. So they're saying we actually haven't ever enacted that. It was also noted that because the number of young married women appointed to head teachers' post was tending to increase the number of occasions on which the committee had to make temporary arrangements of staff, that was also increasing. So more and more young women are taking those jobs, which means they're more likely to fall pregnant, which means it's causing a hassle to the system. The Director of Education suggested that if married women sought to combine a professional career, particularly a career which involved them in the management of a school, with rearing a family, it would not be unreasonable for the Education Committee to adhere to the terms of teachers' conditions. So he's saying, actually, we think it would be very sensible to put them on a reserve list rather than giving them their job back. After discussion, the committee resolved to inform all married women holding promoted posts that the Education Committee would observe the sick pay regulations insofar as those regulations referred to the absence on account of pregnancy. So, yes, interesting. And I'm sure many people watching will have memories of similar things. The 1975 Sex Discrimination Act was superseded by the Equality Act of 2010, which protects people against discrimination, harassment or victimisation due to age, disability, gender reassignment, marital status, pregnancy, race, religion, sex or sexual orientation. So we've come a very long way, and we have a huge number of people to thank who have stood up and have fought and have taken that fight to the people with the power. But we still have a very long way to go. Now, I'm conscious that I haven't touched on fights for rights based on disability or based on race or ethnicity, and that's largely because there isn't a huge amount of that in our collections, but also because I don't want to do a disservice to that and shoehorn it in. We hold a few references to fights for freedom in the Caribbean plantations owned by where slaves were owned by Scottish landowners, and so I want to see if I can make that into standalone Learn with Lorna. I'm not sure if we'll have enough on it, but I want to do that. But I'm just very conscious that I haven't spoken a huge amount around rights related to disability or ethnicity. But I wanted to finish on a lighter note. I wanted to finish with another story from the 1970s, this time from 1975. In May of that year, Wick High School rector John Ross banned pupils from wearing Bay City Rollers style tartan trousers and scarves. If anyone had any of these items of clothing, I would like to hear from you. He was afraid, and it's a really interesting thing around clothing and what clothing can symbolise and what it can do. Anyone familiar with football clubs in one town will know that. The rector of Wick High School was concerned that there was a chance of rival groups forming with this kind of uniform of the Bay City Rollers tartan. If anyone doesn't know the Bay City Rollers, go and look them up and have a dance. So he was concerned that factions would be created and violence would break out in the school. He said that it used to just be a few people who decided to wear the Bay City Rollers clothes, but now their numbers have trebled and slogans have started to appear on the school walls to show who rules the school. Now, the pupils defied this ban on wearing tartan. Interesting again, the tartan ban again. They were determined that they had the right to wear what they wanted to wear. Have a listen to these letters sent in to the John O'Groat Journal at the time. Sir, as pupils of Wick High School, we feel it is an injustice that the rector, Mr. John Ross, should prevent us from wearing Bay City Roller style trousers and tartan scarves, as it doesn't interfere with our routine at school, and as we buy the trousers ourselves, we think that we should be allowed to wear them. Mr. Ross has told us not to wear the trousers and scarves, but he hasn't really said why we shouldn't, and has not warned the teacher about the sort of clothes they wear. We feel that we speak on behalf of most of the school when we say that we cannot see why we shouldn't be allowed to dress the way we want to at school. After all, we aren't harming anyone. We think that the Deputy Rector, Mr. William Oliver, is behind all of this, and that possibly he plans to bring in school uniform, which we will refuse to wear. We are determined not to give in on this matter. We are 3 second-year pupils. And then there's another one, which made me laugh. If the teachers are allowed to go dressed as hippies in their modern gear, I don't see why the children can't do the same. So it's all kicking off in Wick. Now, the Thurso High School rector, Dr. Young, took a different tack. He said, I don't like it, but I think you have to go with the times and you have to turn a blind eye. And this rumbled on for some weeks, with pupils protesting and some quite extensive press coverage about it. But eventually it came to an end when the Wick teaching staff all came out in support of the rector to say that they didn't want Bay City Rollers, tartan trousers and scarves to be worn. But there's an interesting piece in the John O'Groat Journal, the editor's piece entitled Afterthought, and this is what it said. We have some sympathy for the self-styled martyrs of Wick High School. It's difficult for the confident, self-assertive youngsters of today to comply meekly when supposedly dictatorial instructions are handed down from above. It's right that they should not succumb unquestioningly to authority. But Their decision to have a standoff confrontation with their headmaster over his ban on the wearing of Bay City Rollers trousers does them little credit, or the parents who have supported them. Their stand on such a trivial issue shows little respect and loyalty for their school. So interesting there that yes, you're absolutely right to stand up. Don't unquestioningly submit to authority. However, there are times when it's right to submit to authority and you're being trivial about this. But what I found really interesting was the next paragraph. Their abhorrence of compulsory school uniform contrasts strangely with their demands to be allowed to wear Bay City Rollers trousers. For this 7-day commercially exploited fashion wonder is, whatever else it might be, is a uniform. And it is one which the headmaster rightly feels could lead to rivalries and violence. So just really interesting going, you're saying you don't want to be forced into wearing a uniform by the school, but actually what you're doing is you're being forced into wearing a uniform by the commercial music sector. And you don't seem to see that in the same way. Goes on to say, we too have an abhorrence of children being regimented into drab, unfashionable school uniforms. But we are sure that if all the Wick High School pupils were ordered to wear Bay City Rollers trousers, the outcry would be considerably greater than the storm of the past week caused by banning them. Whatever they may wish to wear in their leisure hours, pupils owe it to themselves, their parents and their school to dress neatly and with moderation. That goes for the hippie type teachers too. Doing your own thing can be carried too far. So there are all sorts of examples within our collections of people fighting for many rights. People fighting for the right to vote, for the right to extend their property, for the right to have a say on what happens in their town, and for the right to wear Bay City Rollers trousers. I wanted to just finish on a slightly more serious note by just saying, if we know anything from looking back over this, right through from Magna Carta to the Equality Act, we know that things can be overturned, and we need to appreciate and cherish the rights that we do have. Thank you very much for joining me. I hope you can join me again next week. I hope you found that interesting. Next week I'll be looking at prisons and prisoners in our collections. So I hope you can join me then. But in the meantime, thank you very much for your company and all your lovely comments. It's always so nice to see them coming up. So thank you. And if you're watching later, please do still comment because I will see them. Thank you very much. A reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. That High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. If you're able to donate towards our work, then we would be very, very grateful. And if anyone is able to join me at 2 o'clock, I will be giving a talk for Historic Environment Scotland. If you have a look at either our Facebook page or Historic Environment Scotland's, then you'll be able to book onto that. Thank you very much. I know, Linda, I never thought I would talk about the Bay City Rollers and Magna Carta in one episode. Who knew? See you next week.